A lasting peace agreement between the United States and Iran cannot be understood as a simple negotiation between two governments sitting across a table. The reality is far more complicated because powerful regional players, especially Israel and America's Arab allies in the Gulf, heavily influence the direction, limits, and survival of any diplomatic effort. Among all these actors, Israel is often viewed as the most determined opponent of a soft or incomplete agreement with Iran. Israeli leaders across different political parties have long argued that Iran's nuclear ambitions represent an existential threat to the survival of the Israeli state. For decades, Israeli intelligence agencies and military officials have warned Washington that Tehran could use diplomacy as a strategy to buy time, reduce sanctions pressure, and continue expanding its regional influence indirectly. Because of this belief, many Israeli policymakers remain deeply skeptical whenever American administrations reopen negotiations with Iran. The central fear in Israel is not only about nuclear weapons themselves, but about the broader consequences of normalization between Washington and Tehran. Israeli strategists worry that if the United States lifts major sanctions or restores economic ties, Iran could gain billions of dollars in oil revenue and foreign investment. From the Israeli perspective, that economic recovery might strengthen Iranian military programs, missile development, and support for armed groups allied with Tehran across the Middle East. Israel frequently points to organizations operating in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Gaza, and Yemen as evidence that Iran already projects power beyond its borders without possessing a nuclear weapon. Israeli officials therefore argue that giving Iran financial breathing room without fully dismantling its military infrastructure could shift the regional balance of power against Israel and its partners. This concern explains why Israeli governments have repeatedly lobbied American presidents, members of Congress, and Western allies to adopt a tougher position toward Iran. During earlier nuclear negotiations, Israeli leaders publicly criticized diplomacy that they believed placed too much trust in Tehran's promises. In some periods, these disagreements even created visible tension between Washington and Tel Aviv. Israeli security institutions have also reportedly prepared independent military options in case diplomacy fails or if Iran approaches nuclear weapons capability. That possibility places additional pressure on American negotiators because the United States must constantly consider how Israeli reactions could affect regional stability. At the same time, Israel's influence is not based only on military concerns. The relationship between the United States and Israel is deeply rooted in decades of strategic cooperation, intelligence sharing, domestic political support, and shared security interests. Because of that alliance, Israeli concerns carry enormous weight in American foreign policy debates. Even when U.S. administrations pursue diplomacy with Iran, they usually attempt to reassure Israel through military aid, intelligence cooperation, or public commitments to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. This balancing act makes negotiations extremely delicate. American diplomats may seek compromise with Tehran, but they must also avoid creating the impression that they are abandoning Israel's security concerns. As a result, Israel becomes both a participant and an indirect obstacle in the search for lasting peace between the United States and Iran. Israeli leaders fear that a weak agreement could strengthen a long-term rival, while Iranian leaders often view Israeli pressure as proof that Washington cannot negotiate independently. This triangular mistrust makes diplomacy slower, more fragile, and more vulnerable to collapse whenever regional tensions rise. Arab Gulf allies of the United States, especially Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, also play a major role in determining whether a lasting peace agreement between America and Iran can truly succeed. Unlike Israel, many Gulf Arab states do not always oppose diplomacy itself. In fact, after years of regional wars, missile attacks, and economic uncertainty, several Arab governments increasingly prefer stability over direct confrontation. Their economies depend heavily on secure oil exports, international investment, tourism growth, and safe shipping routes through the Persian Gulf. Any military escalation between the United States and Iran could threaten those interests immediately. Because of this, many Arab leaders quietly support efforts that reduce the chances of war. However, support for diplomacy does not mean full trust in Iran. Deep political, religious, and strategic rivalries still shape relations between Tehran and many Arab capitals. For decades, Gulf monarchies have accused Iran of interfering in Arab affairs through allied militias and political movements across the Middle East. Countries like Saudi Arabia often point to Iranian influence in Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria as proof that Tehran seeks regional dominance rather than peaceful coexistence. The war in Yemen especially intensified these fears because Saudi leaders viewed attacks from the Houthi movement as directly linked to Iranian support. Even during periods of diplomatic improvement between Iran and Gulf states, suspicion remains deeply rooted inside military institutions and political leadership circles. Many Arab governments therefore worry that a U.S. Iran agreement focused only on nuclear issues could ignore broader regional security concerns that affect Arab states every day. Another major concern among Gulf allies is the fear of being sidelined during negotiations. Arab governments remember earlier periods when Washington and Tehran held indirect talks while Gulf states had little direct influence over the outcome. This created anxiety that the United States might prioritize preventing nuclear escalation while paying less attention to missile threats, drone warfare, maritime security, or Iran-backed armed groups operating near Arab borders. Gulf leaders fear that if sanctions on Iran are lifted without strict regional conditions, Tehran could gain economic resources that strengthen its military reach across the Middle East. From their perspective, a narrow nuclear agreement may reduce tensions temporarily while leaving the deeper geopolitical struggle unresolved. At the same time, the Gulf region has changed significantly in recent years. Some Arab countries have started cautiously improving relations with Iran through diplomatic meetings, trade discussions, and security dialogue. Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, reopened diplomatic channels after years of hostility, partly because both sides recognize the high cost of endless confrontation. These developments show that Arab states are not necessarily seeking permanent conflict. Instead, many are trying to balance deterrence with diplomacy. They want protection from American security partnerships while also avoiding a devastating regional war that could damage their economies and internal stability. This creates a complicated situation for the United States. Washington must reassure Arab allies that their security concerns will not be ignored, while simultaneously convincing Iran that diplomacy is possible without constant threats or isolation. As long as Gulf states remain uncertain about Iran's intentions, they are unlikely to fully support any agreement that appears too favorable to Tehran. Therefore, Arab allies are not absolute obstacles to peace, but they remain powerful voices capable of shaping, slowing, or influencing the success of any long-term U.S.-Iran settlement. Although Israel and America's Arab allies are often described as major obstacles to peace between the United States and Iran, the deeper and more fundamental barrier is the historic distrust that exists directly between Washington and Tehran themselves. Even if regional allies fully supported negotiations tomorrow, the United States and Iran would still face enormous disagreements rooted in decades of conflict, sanctions, military confrontations, and political hostility. Since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, relations between the two countries have been shaped by mutual suspicion. American leaders have long accused Iran of supporting armed militant groups, threatening regional stability, and pursuing dangerous nuclear ambitions. Iranian leaders, meanwhile, view the United States as a hostile superpower that has repeatedly interfered in Iran's internal affairs, imposed crippling sanctions, and attempted to isolate the Islamic Republic politically and economically. These opposing narratives have become deeply embedded in both governments and societies, making compromise extremely difficult. One of the biggest issues dividing Washington and Tehran is the question of trust and guarantees. Iranian leaders argue that previous agreements showed America could reverse its commitments whenever political leadership changes in Washington. After years of negotiations that produced earlier nuclear understandings, many in Iran felt betrayed when sanctions pressure later returned and diplomatic progress collapsed. Because of that experience, Tehran now seeks stronger guarantees that future American administrations cannot easily abandon another agreement. On the other side, American policymakers remain skeptical that Iran would permanently limit sensitive nuclear activities or reduce regional military influence. U.S. officials fear that Iran could comply temporarily while preserving the technical capability to restart advanced nuclear programs later. This mutual fear creates a negotiation environment where both sides constantly suspect hidden motives behind every proposal. Another critical obstacle involves the broader power struggle across the Middle East. The United States maintains military partnerships, naval forces, and strategic alliances throughout the region, while Iran seeks greater regional influence and security independence. Tehran views American military presence near its borders as a threat, while Washington argues its presence protects allies and ensures regional stability. These opposing security visions collide in places like Iraq, Syria, the Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea, where both countries often support rival actors. Even when diplomatic talks improve temporarily, regional incidents such as militia attacks, assassinations, cyber operations, or naval confrontations can quickly destroy fragile progress. This means that peace negotiations are never isolated from events happening elsewhere in the region. Domestic politics inside both countries also make lasting peace harder to achieve. In the United States, Iran policy is heavily debated between Republicans and Democrats, with some politicians supporting diplomacy while others favor maximum pressure and stronger military deterrence. In Iran, internal political factions also disagree over how much trust should be placed in America. Hardline groups often argue that Washington's real goal is not compromise but weakening Iran strategically over time. These internal divisions reduce flexibility for negotiators because leaders fear appearing weak in front of domestic audiences. Any agreement can therefore become vulnerable to elections, leadership changes, or political crises on either side. Because of all these factors, regional allies like Israel and Gulf Arab states are only part of the challenge. The real difficulty lies in transforming decades of hostility into a stable relationship built on predictable rules, security guarantees, and gradual confidence building. Without addressing the core mistrust between Washington and Tehran, even the most carefully designed peace agreement would remain fragile. Lasting peace would require not only diplomatic signatures, but also long-term political commitment, regional cooperation, and a willingness from both sides to slowly replace confrontation with managed coexistence.